When it comes to weapons in D&D, not all of them were created equal, and many are considered to be mechanically subpar. On top of this, the rulebooks don't provide us much detail on these weapons, leaving us to fill in the gaps of how our weapons look and feel. Due to this lack of information, I'd like to go through and examine all the weapons of D&D to answer: what is this weapon, both in history and in D&D? How is it different from the other weapons available? And does it need to be made better, and how can we do so? For today's video, let's poke at an iconic polearm that revolutionized warfare twice: the pike. The pike is a long spear intended for thrusting. Measuring from 3 to 7 meters long, it could weigh up to 6 kilograms, and generally required 2 hands to wield effectively. Unlike the short spear, the pike's length and weight made it unwieldy for single combat. As a result, it was largely intended to be used in formations, where rows of pikes would create a wall which made it difficult for opposing infantry or cavalry to get close. Long spears as a concept have been around since ancient times, with Sumerian artwork depicting phalanx-like formations as early as 2400 BC. These spear formations were common among ancient cultures in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean, but the term phalanx wouldn't emerge until the time of Homer in the 8th century BC. Used to refer to the Greek formation of hoplites, these early spear formations would use the shorter dory spear, which measured around 2.4 meters long. It wasn't until the military reformations of Macedonian King Philip II in the 4th century BC that phalanxes swapped to the sarissa pike. Alright, so this is where I'm going to pause for a bit and talk about some semantics, because I always get comments about it and I want to put it to bed here. In ancient Greece, the birthplace of Alexander the Great was spelled like this, where that K letter had a hard K sound. When it got translated into Latin, the Greek K was replaced with the Latin C, but retained its original pronunciation. After the 5th century, the Latin C started to soften, giving it the S pronunciation, and resulting in us calling the region Macedon or Macedonia today. When discussing historical locations, however, some academics refer to things by their historical or cultural name, and thus use the original pronunciation of the Latin C and Greek K. This is why some people refer to Caesar as Kaisar or Cicero as Cicero, but you don't order a Kaisar salad at a local restaurant. Now, I don't personally speak Greek, and I did not study Latin in school because someone convinced me that German would be more useful. But I also grew up playing way too much Rome Total War, and the different pronunciations kinda got burned into my brain.
Gods, I hate Gauls.
So, does pronouncing it Macedon really make a difference? Not really. Either pronunciation would technically be fine, so long as people understand what you're referring to. So with all of that laid out, let's get back to talking about the pike. Distinguished by its great length, the infantry sarissa was 5 to 7 meters long and weighed around 6 kilograms, though modern reconstructions tend to be only 4 kilograms. Wielded in formations 8 to 16 men deep, the pike made the Macedonian phalanx practically invulnerable from the front, though it was vulnerable to uneven terrain or flanking maneuvers. The pike phalanx spread throughout Greece through the conquests of Alexander the Great, and dominated the classical and Hellenistic periods. After the fall of the Macedonian successor kingdoms, the pike began to disappear from the battlefield as the Roman Empire took over the Mediterranean, but there are scattered reports of Celtic and Germanic tribesmen using overly long spears that may have been pikes in the 2nd century AD. As Europe moved from the Classical Age into the Middle Ages, pikes began to reappear on the battlefield, though some downsides also reappeared. In the Wars of Scottish Independence, for example, the the Scots used the Schiltron pike formation against armored English cavalry, able to break their charge before engaging in melee. While these pike formations were effective, they were also vulnerable to ranged fire. At the Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333, English archers were able to shoot into the flanks of the tightly packed Scottish Schiltrons as they approached. Weakened and exhausted, the Scots routed shortly after engaging, resulting in several thousand Scottish casualties compared to the English's 14. In this same time period, the Chinese Ming dynasty was also employing pikes to great effect. While dagger axes measuring 5.5 meters long had existed in China since the Warring States period, General Qi Jiguang created the Mandarin Duck Formation, which utilized pikemen alongside other polearms and shields in 12-man squads. Over in Japan, the Yari spear became a mainstay for Ashigaru forces in the Sengoku Jidai, but a longer variant, known as the Nagai Yari, emerged in the 16th century. Adopted by Oda Nobunaga, this pike measured between 5 and 6 meters long, and was given to the Oda clan's Ashigaru to be more effective against armored opponents and cavalry. Back in Europe, the transition to the Renaissance era refined the pike into a main infantry weapon. As stated before, medieval pike formations were vulnerable to ranged fire, and using them defensively only exaggerated this problem. Using a pike formation aggressively, however, required a lot of discipline and tactical unity in the formation, which the urban militias using the pike initially lacked. The Swiss solved this problem in the 15th century, drilling their mercenaries to be more maneuverable within combat. This, in addition to marching drums, allowed pike formations to stay on the offensive without opening up their flanks. These tactics saw great success in the 15th and 16th centuries, and quickly spread to most European armies as a reemergence of Alexander the Great's tactical innovation. In Niccolo Machiavelli's The Art of War, he states, "I conjecture that a Macedonian phalanx was nothing else than a battalion of Swiss is today, who have all their strength and power in their pikes." Indeed, the pike was so effective that even the introduction of early firearms didn't displace it on the battlefield. Instead, firearms were integrated with pike formations to create the method of fighting known as pike and shot. Early firearms like the arquebus took a long time to reload, leaving them vulnerable to cavalry charges, so units of pikemen would be kept nearby to protect them, while men-at-arms would focus on driving off enemy pikemen. These mixed unit tactics are largely attributed to the Spanish tercio, but quickly became the norm for European infantry tactics as firearms became more reliable and effective. This was utilized to great effect by Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army during the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651. All good things must come to an end, however. While there were early plug bayonets that turned muskets into pseudo-spears, they sacrificed the ability to shoot, so pikes were still required as a supplement to firearms. It wasn't until the socket bayonet was introduced in the 1690s that the bayonet made pikemen redundant, and while bayoneted muskets didn't have the same reach as a pike, European armies began to replace the pike by 1700, though Swedish and Russian armies used it well into the 1730s. There were some modern attempts to revive the pike, but it never quite reached the same level of adoption as it had in the Renaissance era. In the early years of the American Revolution, pikes known as trench spears saw limited use in the Continental Army and their supporting militias, until they could procure more bayonets. At the outset of the American Civil War, the Confederate States of America planned to recruit 20 regiments of pikemen, and while the plan was supported by General Robert E. Lee, it was abandoned before the pike could be used in that conflict. In the modern era, the pike is largely a ceremonial weapon, used in guard duty or to carry a regiment's colors. Its role as a formation weapon limits its use in historical martial arts, which generally focus on single combat. But the pike's legacy continues to reach our modern lives in media and gaming. In D&D, the pike is described as a type of long spear intended for thrusting and piercing attacks. Varying between 5 and 7 meters in length, pikes were great for keeping enemies at a distance, using their better reach to hit enemies before they closed in. Present since 1st edition, the pike of older editions cost between 3 and 15 gold pieces, weighed between 2.7 and 5.4 kilograms, and dealt either 1d6 or 1d8 piercing damage depending on the edition. In 5th edition, the pike costs 5 gold pieces, weighs 8 kilograms, deals 1d10 piercing damage, and has the heavy, reach, and two-handed weapon properties. Sitting as the heaviest melee weapon in D&D, the pike follows the same trend established by the glaive and halberd. It does good damage, it has an extended reach, and it's relatively cheap for a martial weapon, while also having excessively high weight and a lack of usability for small races. The problem with the glaive and halberd was that they were basically 2 copies of the same weapon. And while the pike does piercing damage instead of slashing, alongside its lower cost and higher weight, it basically fills the same role as those other reach weapons. Now, this does not make the pike a bad weapon by any stretch of the imagination. There is a valid argument for damage type being enough to justify a weapon's existence, even if not a lot of monsters have different resistances or vulnerabilities that make mundane damage type matter. When looking at it on the whole, it just feels a bit redundant alongside the glaive and halberd, which doesn't really mesh well with the idea that all the weapons of D&D should be rewarding, impactful, and fun to use. So, the pike could use some help in standing out above the crowd. For players looking at reach weapons for their character, the pike would be a pretty good option. But simply being a piercing weapon isn't enough, in my opinion, to distinguish it from the halberd or glaive. So, if we want the difference between a pike and a halberd to be a bit clearer, we can add some unique features that give the pike its own personality and flair. As such, let's look at some ways that we can improve the pike in D&D. My first suggestion is to give the pike a melee reach of 15 feet instead of 10 feet. Pikes have always been some of the longest melee weapons in human history, with one of their main draws being their ability to reach enemies before the enemy reaches you. Having a longer reach than the other polearms in D&D would bring them in line with how they were used historically, and even justify how heavy they currently are. This would, in turn, make the pike the longest reaching weapon in the game. But in my videos on the glaive and halberd, I also suggested adding more versatile options to those weapons. This would create a distinction between the different reach weapons, allowing players to choose the pike if they want a really high reach, but not getting the flexibility or versatility that a glaive or halberd could provide. In tandem with this, I'd also suggest adding a negative, as without one, the pike would probably be a bit too broken when combined with a bugbear race or the sentinel and polearm master feats. To keep the pike in line with other weapons, we could give it a version of the lance's special ability, which states that you have disadvantage when attacking an enemy within 5 feet of you with this weapon. With this suggestion, pike wielders would have to keep maneuvering on the battlefield or risk getting swarmed in close quarters. My second suggestion on how to improve the pike would be to give it a weapon property that allows it to push enemies. In the 1D&D UA, the pike was given the push weapon mastery, which states that if you hit a creature with this weapon, you can push it up to 10 feet away from you, assuming it's no more than one size larger than you. With this weapon property, the pike would be able to keep enemies at a distance, which is where the pike is most effective, and it works in tandem with my previous suggestion. On top of that, it gives the pike some control options on the battlefield, used to force enemy movement and keep them where you want them. The only thing I would add here is that I think this ability should only be usable once per turn, as classes with multiple attacks would be able to push enemies ridiculously far away if they hit all of their attack rolls. Finally, my third suggestion on how to improve the pike in D&D is to add a way to brace the weapon against charges. In 3rd edition, when wielding certain polearms, characters could set their weapon against a charge. If a readied weapon struck a charging character, it would deal double damage with the attack. Just like when I brought this up for spears and halberds, this would make the pike better while using the ready action, while also fitting how the pike was historically used. If we were to implement this into 5th edition, my idea is to add a weapon property called Spear Wall, which states that when a character has a pike equipped, they can use the ready action to set up a spear wall. When a creature enters the threatened area of a character using Spear Wall, that character can use their reaction to attack with their weapon. If the opportunity attack hits, roll extra dice for the attack's damage against the target, as if it were a critical hit. While this property would conflict with aspects of the polearm master feat, the proposed feature costs more in the action economy to use. So this brings a fun but costly action option to the pike, while not completely invalidating polearm master. All in all, these are just a few of my own suggestions on how to improve the pike in D&D. If we ignored all of these suggestions and kept the pike completely as it is now, it would remain a dependable piercing weapon that meshes well with a lot of different classes, races, and feats. That being said, I think we have an opportunity here to help the pike become a bit more distinct within the weapon roster, giving players more opportunities to make meaningful choices that impact the game in fun and interesting ways. But with that, we come to the end of today's video on the pike. A poignant piercing weapon, the pike performs perfectly as it is now. Even with that in mind though, adding some more unique features can transform the pike from just another reach weapon into a dedicated zoning weapon that offers the best melee reach in the game. However, what I want to know is, what do you think of the pike? Do you think it should stay as it is now? Did you like some of the suggestions I put forward, or did you have your own ideas on how to improve the pike in D&D? You can let me know down in the comments, or you can discuss it on the Altroll Discord using the link in the description. If you want to support Altroll, you can visit our Ko-fi to leave a one-time or recurring donation. And make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to be notified when our videos go live. However, that's all I had for you. Thank you all for watching, make sure to have a great rest of your day, and I'll see all of you next time.